Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fantasy Life Show. I am Dwain McFarland, and I'm going to be hanging out with my good buddy, Mr. Ian Hartitz, as we break down his way too early rankings for the 2025 fantasy football season. We're going to kick things off at the quarterback position where dual threats rule the world, and we have a new player joining the top tier to go along with Mr. Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, so let's get to it.
Dwain, we're kicking things right here at the top with four dual threat aliens who I imagine will be a pretty much consensus top four by the time fantasy drafts come around in August. Starting off with the reigning QB1 is Lamar Jackson, probably the MV3 himself, followed by Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels taking that 3 spot, and then Jalen Hurts. So really, I think, again, not too controversial when you just look at the archetypes of the different quarterbacks around here. These guys do stand out because not on 700 plus yards, they also have legit 4,000 plus passing yard upside. Maybe not as much as Hurts, but you get what I'm saying here. The question, Dwayne, is how early would you actually be willing to draft some of these guys? Because Lamar and Josh Allen, man, might have to pay up a second or third round price at this point.
Well, a lot of this ends up coming down to who do you think you can take later, right? That's how we create a lot of our draft strategy. This past year, Jaden Daniels was the guy that we were on saying, look, you don't have to take one of the early ones. Just wait and take Jaden Daniels. Now, we didn't expect him to be that good, but we thought he would be good enough to help offset some of the points that people that were spending early round picks on quarterbacks, that he would be enough to help offset it, while you were also getting to take more wide receivers, running backs, that sort of thing in those rounds. So I will say this year, we don't have as clear of a player, Ian, that's sitting down there. Like we look at the rookie class that's coming in. It's not to say that, one of those guys won't be a dual threat quarterback and potentially give us some fantasy goodness, but not at the same confidence level that we had with Jaden Daniels last year. So I do think this will be a year where you could take one of these guys in the earlier rounds. I think the way I'm going to mostly play it, I like all of them. I would like exposure to all of them. But, we know a lot of people aren't playing in, 150, 300 best ball leagues like some of the sickos, me and you on this show. You're playing in one fantasy league. You're playing in two. And that's where I think it becomes a tougher, decision. But I do think that you have the names right for these players. But I'm thinking rounds 4 to 5. I typically don't like to break the seal too early. Now, a couple of years ago, we did have the quarterbacks going super early, so you had to do it a little bit sooner. But typically, one of these will slide down, and they're all in the same tier. And that's why you're creating the tier is it's because, okay, great, maybe Josh Allen ends up, or Lamar Jackson ends up being a second round pick. But if you can get Josh Allen for some reason at the end of the third, or you can get Jaden Daniels in the 4th or the 5th, I'm going to take the one that is going cheaper, right, in drafts most likely. So I do like the way you set this up. I think there's almost a case you could make, and I know we don't want to. We could have tiers out our ears if we did this, but Jalen Hurts really more in a mini tier of his own, right, below these other guys, because I don't think he carries. I think we're at the point in his career where we have to say he doesn't have 4,500 yard upside passing like the other guys do. Lamar, even a little more tricky. Like Jaden, we don't know what the ceiling is yet for Jaden's passing game. So Jaden, I think it's him with Josh Allen plus Lamar, then Jalen Hurts.
It's just one of those things where I hear you, even in terms of, I think, real life ability. I wouldn't consider Hurts on the same level as these 3 other players. But, man, all those tush-push touchdowns just add up in a major way in fantasy land. And, again, that is why he's going to be ahead of all the other pocket passers. But I actually had the privilege, Dwayne, of doing a way too early mock draft with a bunch of the Roto World fam over there, Denny Carter, Pat Daugherty. Make sure you guys check out the Roto World football show, for some full thoughts on that. But I was surprised to actually see Hurts fall all the way to the beginning of round 6. We had Lamar Jackson at the beginning of round 3, Josh Allen right after there in round 4, and then again Jaden Daniels starting off round 5. So I'll say round 5 or 6, for Daniels and Hurts especially, much more willing to get behind, because at that point, man, we're already clearing, the top 20, top 25 wide receivers, top 10 or 12 running backs, and those big tight ends. But I do agree with you. Always does come down to who can we maybe get later that fits that archetype. Honestly, though, Dwayne, just again, based on what we're seeing very early and what some people are maybe thinking, maybe some recency bias from last year, I do wonder if some of the, less than stellar dual threat performers from last year do wind up being viable late round options. Kyler Murray, Anthony Richardson, maybe even Drake May, guys that, again, do fit what we're looking for in terms of having that upside on the ground. Not as sure things as passers. That's why they're going later. But as things stand right now, those would be the late round darts I think we can maybe get away with at the position.
No, Anthony Richardson, absolutely. Like, I'm going to have him ranked higher than probably where you have him right now in your early article. And it's all because it's about upside. I think the question you have to ask yourself about Anthony Richardson is, was Anthony Richardson's season last year as a dual threat player an outlier, or is Anthony Richardson himself an outlier? And when I say outlier, typically, if you have a guy that runs as much as Anthony Richardson does and is as good at it as he is, it's almost like a can't miss in fantasy football. You're going to be a top 10 to top 8 player. Anthony Richardson, maybe he's the guy that can push the boundaries of that, Ian, because his completion percentage is so bad. It makes him just an undependable option. Maybe he doesn't end up on the field. But, man, if he's out there and if he's playing, he has the ceiling that you are looking for. There's a very good chance that it was just an outlier season where it didn't work out for the dual threat. Look, we've seen Justin Fields, we've seen Taysom Hill, we've seen some guys that were really terrible passers put up really nice fantasy numbers just on the ground alone at the quarterback position. So Anthony Richardson will be a major priority for me this season. It's going to be tough, because it's not like you're going into the draft saying you're going to count on him. He's a guy where I would take a second quarterback. If I waited on quarterback, and let's say I ended up, we're going to talk about a lot of guys here in the middle rounds where it's like, okay, they're fine. We like them. We feel good about their floor. They're not going to kill you. You pair him with someone like that, right? And then if he does hit, you hit really big. So it's all about upside. Plus, most of you are going to be playing in managed leagues. You can replace that. So what if you miss on Anthony Richardson? Swing for the fences, because he is the one guy going super late that we could look up and be like, oh, wow, we were just wrong about it last year. And even though he still stinks as a passer, he's a top 6 quarterback in fantasy because of those legs. So, yeah, like when I look at Richardson, he is one of the guys I'm definitely going to be higher on consensus, probably by a lot than a lot of the fantasy industry.
And he was, ranked basically consensusly last year as a top 5, top 6 quarterback. But the difference was going into last year, it never even crossed my mind that this dude could be benched. I thought the leash was going to be as long as, possible for a guy they selected with the 4th overall pick. Obviously, it wasn't the case. Maybe it was because he tapped himself out of the ball game. But again, seeing Joe Flacco unironically without an injury, just replacing Richardson, really it was concerning. Maybe that was just Jim Irsay, taking the reins over Shane Steichen. But we don't know. And I guess that's the only reason, Dwain, why I don't have Richardson ranked higher. Spoiler, I think he's my QB 20 right now in these ranks. He'd be a lot closer to QB 12 if we, again, had that certainty he is going to be the man out there. But, hey, there's a reason we don't have Justin Fields in that top 10, top 12, even though he would be right there with the certainty of having that starting job. I just get worried, man. What if we do see a Sam Darnold or an Aaron Rodgers type of player in Indy? Again, I feel so much worse about Richardson's long-term standing in Indianapolis this year than I did this time last year. So more on him in a little bit. We'll try to avoid making this the 40-minute Anthony Richardson show, but just realize, again, he would be one of those later round archetypes who maybe could, find their way into this top 4 if everything goes right for him. So shout out again to those dual threat aliens at the top. Moving on to tier 2, though, Dwain, we only have 2 guys sitting here, but they are top tier passing phenoms, Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes. Yes, we are going back to that well. So I think the first question, though, with Joe Burrow is how much of last year was him just being arguably the best pure passing quarterback in the league? And Dwain, how much was maybe just the perfect set of circumstances, both in terms of the Bengals offense and even their lackluster defense, coming together to make 2024 a very special season, at least in terms of box score production?
Well, I think the lack of a defense turned him from a 4,500 yard, 35 touchdown passer into a 5,000 yard and 43 touchdown passer. So, you're going from a guy that averaged 22.7 fantasy points per game in 2022 with that other stat line I mentioned versus this last year scored 23 fantasy points per game. So there's also a difference of 1 game. So there's that also going on in the stats. But when you look at Burrow, even the season before in 16 games had 44-72 plus 34 touchdowns. So I think there's an argument to be made. He doesn't fit the archetype you were talking about of having that rushing upside. But I think there's an argument to be made that Joe Burrow, if we're just going on fantasy points and expectations, that he belongs in tier 1, because even in the 2 seasons before we had the disastrous results from the Bengals defense, which allowed more upside this year, he still averaged that 22.7 and 20.6 fantasy points per game. So T. Higgins, I think that's the question here, Ian. What happens to the wide receiver core? If you lose T. Higgins, if you don't really find a good replacement, maybe they have to change the offense a little bit. Maybe they don't throw the ball as much. You still got Jamar Chase, assuming you get that deal done. You're going to feel good about that. But if they get T. Higgins back and they have Jamar Chase back, then, man, I think there is an argument that Joe Burrow, even though he doesn't fit the archetype of having, that rushing ability, he does fit in tier one. I think he's different than Patrick Mahomes right now. After what we've seen from Mahomes for the last 2 years, I think we're at the point where we have to say, okay, we really need to see something change in Kansas City. I mean, I would easily take Joe Burrow over Mahomes right now.
Yeah, and again, we do have Joe Burrow ranked higher as a QB5, Mahomes QB6. I do wonder if we're being just a bit harsh on Mahomes when you consider all the weapons he was losing out here, okay? Now, some of that was friendly fire. I understand Mahomes took out Rasheed Rice on his own on that ill-fated interception return, but man, Hollywood Brown didn't get a chance to play towards the end of the year. Obviously, Xavier Worthy took a while to kind of find his right role in the offense, and I think we can say at this point, father time is coming for Travis Kelce, even if he's not completely washed here just yet. So I guess that's the thought with Mahomes, is that they're going to have an offseason to hopefully rebuild this passing game and get things a bit closer to what it was supposed to be entering week one of this season. Because to be fair, sixth in passing touchdowns, fourth in passing yards during weeks 8 through 17 last season. And we have seen the Chiefs, explosive playability really increase in the playoffs relative to the, death by 1,000 paper cuts unit that they were putting forward more weeks than not during the regular season. So again, I really think, Dwayne, honestly, after Burrow, those are the big 5 quarterbacks in fantasy football, okay? You can kind of move them around if you want to, but it's a pretty steep teardrop after them. And I think accordingly, just as things stand right now, if I happen to see a sliding Joe Burrow, a sliding Jalen Hurts, I can get them in round 6 or 7. Okay, that's fantastic. I'll probably go ahead and eat that up. But otherwise, I'm not going to make a habit on reaching Mahomes or probably any of these other quarterbacks we're about to talk about.
Yeah, and again, I think that's why maybe we consider dropping Mahomes a tier, because I really do feel like there's a tier break right there. Now, to your point, if they go out and they do a lot of things in the offseason, because look, we've got Rasheed Rice coming back from a major injury. We don't even know if he's going to be the same next year. We also don't know for sure when he'll be back. Sounds like maybe mid-season. Maybe it could just be September that he misses. So we'll obviously be monitoring that. But even if he's back, say the first game of October, Rasheed Rice isn't going to be the same player yet. And you're still going to have to ramp up. Hollywood Brown was a 1-year deal. Xavier Worthy did make some strides at the end of the year, but it does feel like age is finally catching up to Travis Kelce. So not only now are you just trying to add to Kelce, you're actually trying to start to replace Travis Kelce. And if we look at Mahomes over the last 2 years, 18.8 and 18.3 fantasy points per game. We have no doubt about Mahomes. If Mahomes had, if he had Joe Burrow's weapons, if he had T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, he also would have thrown for 5,000 yards and 45 touchdowns. Yeah. So people don't get it twisted. Mahomes is he's a beast, and obviously in NFL terms, best quarterback in the league. If you just get to have one player and you're starting a franchise, Patrick Mahomes. But I do think I want to see several things happen here for Mahomes, and if they don't, I think we have to consider, because you just said it. I think it is a tier break, because if I get to Joe Burrow, and you said it perfectly, if he's sliding, I'm going to take him. If Patrick Mahomes is sliding to the 5th or 6th round, I'm not clicking on him. I'm probably going to go ahead and wait and look at some of the guys later. Now, if he fell another 2 rounds or something, then there's a price for everything. And Mahomes is good enough that he could just, as Jason Witten liked to say, pull a rabbit out of his head, right? He could just have another fantastic season because he's Patrick Mahomes. But I would want it to be de-risked, right, with the price that I'm paying. More like round 7, round 8, probably. Again, we're very early. This is why it's the way too early ranking show. Also, the way too early of thinking about where you would take them in a fantasy draft show.
100%. And Dwayne, remember, that's future Cowboys head coach Jason Witten to you at this point in time. Sad days down there in Dallas. But again, guys, let's go ahead and get to some of these, maybe more difficult to rank quarterbacks right after a quick word from our friends over at DraftKings. Super Bowl 59 is right around the corner, and it is the perfect time to get in on the action with my partners at DraftKings Sportsbook. Right now, they're giving all new customers $200 in bonus bets instantly after betting just $5. This is your shot to make every last play a moment to be remembered. Run, don't walk, don't wait. Download the DraftKings app now and sign up using code FANTASYLIFE. The crown is yours. All right, Dwayne, on to tier 3. We were talking about great passers with some mobility, but again, cannot stress enough that honestly, at this point in time, your QB7 versus the QB14, QB15, I think you could probably flip them and it wouldn't be the most egregious thing I've ever seen. So currently though, I'm rolling with Justin Herbert as my QB7, Brock Purdy as my QB8, and Baker Mayfield as my QB9, again, making up our tier 3 here. So if you want to just kind of extend to tier 4, we have Jordan Love and Bo Nix Knicks really rounding out that one. So 5 guys who we know have pretty much seen every single one of them post some legit fantasy QB1 goodness. And you have that high passing upside with just a bit more of a rushing floor than you're going to get from the Jared Goffs and Tua Tagovailoas of the world. They're stuck more in that QB2 range. But starting things off with Justin Herbert, Dwain, look, for my money's worth, I still maintain that he is a top 5, top 6, real life quarterback out there. I understand our last, data point against the Texans in the playoffs was horrific, but come on, we've seen enough from Herbert over the years to know what he's capable of. The big question coming into this year, however, was, hey, are we actually going to see Harbaugh and Greg Roman open up the offense? And they did, man. At least to a decent extent. Like, he was banged up during the first 4 weeks of the year, had to buy. But once he got healthier, plus 2% drop back rate over expected, that was tied for 7th after the week 5 bye. So no, they're not exactly airing the ball out like the Bengals or anything. But Justin Herbert, for me, Dwain, he's someone that we have seen super high, fantasy success in the past. And God forbid we get an extra stub wide receiver or 2 out there. I do think 2025 could maybe be another great year for him.
Yeah, I think we would love to see the signal, right, of the Chargers as buyers, whether it's through the NFL draft or whether it is through free agency into the weapons around Justin Herbert. To your point, I do think it's encouraging the fact that we did have a Harbaugh-led team actually decide that they wanted to throw the ball more over the second half of the season. And a lot of that all of that comes back to Justin Herbert. Maybe a little Lad McConkey out there doing his thing as well, Ian. So, yeah, I do like Justin Herbert. I'm with you, though. I think this is a tough tier. This could go multiple ways, right? If you told me today, I had to tell you for sure which one of these quarterbacks I want to take in the tier. And I think that's why we do the tiers, because it can be hard. Like, Baker Mayfield is coming off of a better season, but we have Chris Godwin, who's coming back from injury, may not even be on the team. Like, he's ultimately available to go elsewhere. So if you get Godwin back, you get Mike Evans, and then we had the ascension of Jalen McMillan. Kate Otten did a little bit last year. Like, you start kind of, splitting straws here of, okay, who has the better weapons? And if the Chargers didn't do anything else at wide receiver, you probably start leaning a little more to Baker. So I think a lot of this will come down to how we end up finally dicing up these players, and they may move around a little bit in these tiers. Will come down to the supporting cast. Brock Purdy is the interesting name on this one, though, for me, Ian, because we heard yesterday or the day before from John Lynch. Sounds like they're not interested in moving on from Deebo Samuel. Again, it's early. We'll see. I'm sure if the right offer came along, they'd be willing to move on from him. But he said, not in the habit of wanting to get rid of playmakers, even though Deebo struggled this year. You get Ayuk back from injury. He should be back after the first month of the season. You got George Kittle already there. Christian McCaffrey missed most of the season. Juwan Jennings, he comes out and just does things we never thought that he could do. And Ricky Pearsall flashed at the end of the year. So Purdy, I don't think we have a question about the weapons. Even if they moved on from Deebo Samuel, this thing's loaded. And the 49ers are a team that obviously is going to be ranked high. I know they disappointed this year, but it's a team that will be favored, right, heavily to be a team in playoff contentions heading into next season. So I think Brock Purdy, honestly, out of this group, if I had to say it today, is the safest option of this tier, because I really feel good about the weapons. And, Purdy, you're talking about a guy that's 19 to 20 fantasy points per game. I know nobody wants to admit it, but and it doesn't matter the why, right? The fact of the matter is he has the weapons and he continues to do it. So I think Purdy's a pretty stable option in this tier.
I understand the 49ers were a disappointment this past season, but if you could have gone back to August and had, the fantasy genie kind of get in your ear, as you're drafting, they're like, hey, by the way, Ayuk's only going to play 7 games. He's going to rip up his knee. He's going to be gone. McCaffrey's going to miss the first 2.5 months of the season. He's only going to play 3 games. He's out of the picture. Debo's going to be a shell of himself. Trent Williams isn't going to play the second half of the season. I wouldn't have touched Brock Purdy with the 10-foot pole, man. I thought that would have been horrendous news. And the guy went out there and finished as the QB 10 in fantasy points per game, 3rd in yards per attempt. I mean, we've seen him literally the most just efficient quarterback in the league in 2022 and 2023. You can fault EPA per dropback, completion percentage over expected. Not saying he was the best quarterback in the league, but just based on the metrics we like to use, he was the most efficient. But we had those small sample size, Dwain, the 3 games in 2023 where Trent Williams and Debo were out and offense couldn't score more than 17 points. I mean, that was supposed to be the problem with Purdy, and he really did overcome that last year. So certainly can scoot around a little bit more than guys like Goff and Tua. Again, if we don't see the Chargers go ahead and actually add guys to that pass game core, why shouldn't Brock Purdy be QB7?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think when you look at the weapons and you look at the archetype, right, of these quarterbacks, which are going to be dependent on how much do their team want to throw, what kind of weapons do they have around them, I think you can make an argument that he actually belongs at the top of this tier today, right? with room to change, I think the tier is correct. But if I had to choose today, and you told me I get to have one fantasy draft and I have to take a quarterback from this tier, it's probably Purdy for me.
Purdy certainly looking pretty good over the last few years. Last guy in the tier, though, Baker Mayfield. And you kind of touched on some of the bigger points before. Will Chris Godwin be back? He is entering free agency and coming off that dislocated ankle. And we are also now looking at Baker's 8th offensive coordinator in 8 years. So different offensive coordinators, I should say. So last year, man, was incredible. It kind of showed off the highs that we thought were going to be on the table more years than not after that incredible rookie season, where Baker originally set the rookie passing touchdown record, got broke by Justin Herbert a few years later, but really is a point where, Dwain, we now have 2 years of evidence telling us that no, Baker not a perfect quarterback. He does lead the league in interceptions since week 1 of 2023, but the man also leads the league in passing touchdowns. And hey, in fantasy football land, one passing touchdown is worth 4 times as much as one interception. So even for some of Baker's faults, man, really is someone that Tampa Bay clearly trusts, and certainly has the gunslinging capacity to be ranked ahead of some names who, again, maybe better real life quarterbacks, but hey, we're playing fantasy here.
Yeah, I think the other thing that you can take some solace in with Baker is the fact that he continued to ball even after he lost Chris Godwin. It's not like once Godwin left the lineup that his fantasy points per game plummeted. Yeah, it impacted him some games, not saying that the absence of Chris Godwin was nothing for him, but overall, he kept his performances up. And the arrival of Jalen McMillan on the scene late in the season, Ian, as a big play threat, a guy that could help score touchdowns. And then we also had that stretch there where really Cade Otton was out there doing his thing. Remember, we sometimes forget, he was also missing Mike Evans for a stretch of the season. So he had a stretch there without Godwin or Evans. So to still be able to put 22.6 fantasy points per game, that is very, very strong for Baker. Do we probably see some regression? Was there a little bit of luck with that? Probably. But I think you're still looking at an 18 to 20 fantasy point per game player. So again, that's kind of how I think about these tiers. Are they going to be within 1 to 2 fantasy points per game of each other? And I think that he belongs in this group.
Randomly had a ton of success on the ground rushing. He's always been able to scoot around a little bit, don't get me wrong, but 378 rushing yards last season for Baker, everyone. I mean, before that, his previous career high, 165. So saw in the playoff game, he's taking Bobby Wagner head on. Always been a bit of a screw loose in Baker Mayfield somewhere, and has made him a lot of fun to watch, for mostly better lately and sometimes worse over the years.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to the running back position. And oh my goodness, was it a good year in fantasy football in 2024 for running backs? Since 2011, the average fantasy points per game in a PPR scoring format has been 15.5 points for the running back 12. We had 16 guys get over that mark in 2024. That is the most since 2011. But we've got some guys getting older. Yeah, we have some young guys that are ascending up the boards. So let's see how the ranks are shuffling and what it looks like for 2025.
We are doing this in January. Free agency is going to happen. The NFL draft, trades, injuries, the whole 9 yards of madness will inevitably strike these running backs. That said, Dwain, never too early to go ahead and try to see what the landscape is looking like. And accordingly, we'll be going through 7 tiers of players today to, just get a good idea of what is going on. So I want to kick things off with tier 1. We are talking league-winning ballers. Have 3 RBs in this tier: Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, and Jahmyr Gibbs. So don't think we need to harp on Mr. 2K. I think everyone has seen just exactly what he's capable of, both throughout the regular season and then, of course, through his tantalizingly awesome playoff run. But Dwain, honestly, if you want to sit here and tell me that Bijan Robinson is your overall RB1, I wouldn't call you crazy.
Yeah, I think the argument there is you do have the younger player, right? Saquon will be 28.6 technically. Just checked in when the year starts next year. That is the year where, we typically see running backs, they can have some of a decline, but it's not usually like that cliff year we're worried about. So I think you still got plenty of tread left on the tires for Saquon. Obviously the other thing is do some of the rushing touchdowns go away? He was challenged as far as not getting as many targets this year. So Saquon will have to keep that efficiency up. So you could argue age there versus Bijan, really in the prime of his career. But man, it's so hard, Ian, because it's the Eagles offense, the Eagles run game versus Atlanta's. We like Atlanta's, but we love the Eagles run game. So it's just really hard. But I'm with you. I agree. If you want to have Bijan as your running back 1, I think it's fine. You want to have Saquon as the running back 1 overall, I don't think anyone can really argue.
Last year, Saquon led the NFL in touches, and Bijan was right there behind him at number 2. So really, if they wanted to make them a tier of their own, also wouldn't overly disagree. That said, Dwayne, I did find a way to include Mr. Jahmyr Gibbs in here. I know he helped win a lot of people their fantasy titles down the stretch, but that did come hand in hand with David Montgomery missing a bit of time. So look, even before Monty was out of the picture, Gibbs was working as the RB5 in terms of PPR points per game. The man is more than capable of still racking up yardage, even as part of a, slightly just a small committee there in Detroit. Now, the question is, does he deserve to be this high? Because on the one hand, no more Ben Johnson in Detroit. Maybe it is a bit more of a evenly split situation. Maybe Monty even has a bit more rushing share than we used to. On the other hand, Dwayne, maybe Gibbs actually is the one who ends up taking over more of the work. And in that case, overall RB1 upside is in his range of outcomes.
Yeah, and it's all about ceiling. And I have to give you an applause, Hartitz. Just a few short months ago, it was, are we really sure we should be ranking Jahmyr Gibbs over David Montgomery every week? But this was the reason why, because the ceiling. Now, to be fair, if David Montgomery is ever running the Lions offense, all to himself for 4 or 5 games, you guys are also going to love him in fantasy. But yes, Jahmyr Gibbs is an absolute freak, Ian, because of what he can do as a pass receiver, because of what he can do in the explosive play department, right? This is just a guy that can break the touchdown from anywhere on the field. Absolutely saw that down the stretch this year. So I agree with you, though. The question is, does he belong in tier 1? He belongs there on talent. I think you could argue he's actually the most explosive and most talented of the 3 backs we just talked about. But we know he's going to have to share the ball to some degree with David Montgomery, and that's been it's been an even type of split, really. It hasn't been a 60-40 Jahmyr Gibbs kind of thing, which is typically what you would want to see to have him ranked this high. So you are betting on the ceiling. To your point, still going to get fantasy points per game, even the games with David Montgomery. But obviously, if you have the games without Montgomery, that's where it really lies at. The question is, does the change in offensive coordinator potentially open the door for Jahmyr Gibbs to get a larger share of the pie in Detroit? I don't think we have any way of answering that right now, but it's at least a possibility.
It is a possibility. Again, could be the overall RB1 if we knew for certain that he was going to be taking over that backfield. But even if we did know that Monty is going to be playing each and every game out there in a split backfield, it would be tough to move Gibbs too much lower in these ranks regardless. So again, those are our big 3 at the top. Moving along to tier 2, have 2 running backs sitting here in the RB4 and RB5 holes. Tier name elite, but look at them, Dwayne. They're old. Of course, we were talking about Christian McCaffrey and Derrick Henry. So with CMC, look, he joins Jim Brown and freaking LaDainian Tomlinson as the only running backs in NFL history to average at least 20 PPR points per game over the course of their career. And what really surprised me, Dwayne, was if there is ever going to be a time for the 49ers to maybe take their foot off the gas a bit in terms of his workload, coming off the injury that kept him out the first 2.5 months of the season. You have Jordan Mason going out there and really doing a great job running the football. Would have made sense for the 49ers to ease in CMC. That never happened. 88%, 94%, 82% snap rates in his only 3 full games. Dwayne, if CMC, and it's a big if, capitalize it, put it in 20-inch font for all I care, if CMC can stay healthy, he can once again be the RB1.
Yeah, it's still all about ceiling. And when we think about ceiling, we think about that receiving prowess. We just talked about it with Jahmyr Gibbs. CMC not on the same level as far as being that explosive playmaker anymore, Ian, but very involved in the passing game. We're talking about a guy that can have a 20% target share, a guy that can be on the field for 90% of snaps, and an offense that we're really going to be high on again. I know the 49ers have taken a little bit of a step back. Got to make some adjustments probably on the offensive line. There's definitely some things that need to be addressed, Ian. But look, if you got CMC out there with a chance to get 6-7 targets per game and rack up 18 to 19, maybe 20 rushing attempts per game, it's just going to be super hard wearing the red and gold for him to not finish as a top 5 running back. The main risk is obviously the injuries, right? This is an older player. We've seen him battle injuries for the last 5 seasons, but in the years where he's been clean, where he's been healthy, he's still been one of the top guys. So this is a potential high reward sort of pick, but obviously the floor is also super low. I'm with you. I don't really see them, changing the workload. Now, we say that. We never know what coaches are going to do. But based on the studies and research we've done, the best indicator of future volume is past volume, and they've tended to load up CMC. So I think he's going to get the workload. It's just a matter of if he stays healthy. And if he does, man, you're going to feel great about the pick. Obviously, if he gets hurt, you're going to be like, man, I could have taken Brian Thomas Jr. down there at the end of round 1.
Certainly someone that we had in the middle to later parts of round one when we went over that here a week or so ago on the Fantasy Life show. But right next to CMC was our next running back, and that is one Mr. Derrick Henry. So hand up, Dwain. I did publish this article over on fantasylife.com. So any thoughts, criticism, slander you guys want to throw out there about these rankings, please direct it my way. You were saying before the show, Dwain, you actually, if you were in charge here, might have been putting Devon Achane here ahead of Mr. Henry. So look, we're talking about the RB5 and the RB6 in the ranks, so there's not some big time disconnect, but talk about that difference because, hey, as we mentioned with Gibbs and CMC, that receiving upside certainly is a major factor in the equation. And, it doesn't take a genius to figure out Achane has a bit more of that than King Henry.
Well, look, I think this really comes down to how much you care about age, right? So Derrick Henry's going to be 31 years old when the season starts next year. This year, he looked just as good as ever. Right. And part of that is due to getting to play with Lamar Jackson and defenses having to respect that. So you can't completely discount that. Like Derrick Henry could very easily be the same guy we saw this year next season. And if that happens, you're going to feel probably better about drafting Derrick Henry than Devon Achane. The only reason I ask, about Achane, should we potentially actually have him above Derrick Henry and CMC, is we know he's a guy that's still in his prime. He's ascending as far as like all the different roles they're allowing him to handle in Miami. Miami historically been an offense we really like, kind of hit the skids a little bit this year. Probably going to have to figure out some counter punches, some different things with their scheme as the league continues to adapt. I think the big question for Achane, and I would love your thoughts on this because you spent more time diving into these guys after the seasons they just had, is what do we think about the efficiency drop off? Like, we knew it was coming. It had to happen because it was so huge for him as a rookie. Do we think it was more associated with the larger workload, or do we think it's potentially related to the high ankle sprain or the ankle sprain that he suffered earlier in the season? So I think that's part of the question. I will say this. We have seen guys historically drop off in efficiency, whether we're talking about explosive rush rate, yards after contact, missed tackles forced, all those sort of things. And it doesn't necessarily mean that their role stops growing or that it goes the other way. That's something I spent a lot of time last offseason trying to find what's the signal in those sort of things. And we've seen coaches go right back to the well if they trust a guy. So Achane is the one name here for me that I do wonder, honestly, maybe he's more of a bottom of that tier one group. I think the reason you didn't include him there, though, is because he wasn't as efficient. Had he come out here this year and averaged 6 yards a carry with the workload he had, he would have been in tier one, right? But he didn't. So I think that's the important thing to think about. Was that injury related, or was it because he's a smaller back, Ian, and you can't load him up with that? We know we've heard this argument so many times. If you give him more work, the efficiency can drop.
I do think there's just a bit more of a question as to what the Dolphins are going to be doing in their backfield. Again, we're only 1 year removed from Raheem Mostert scoring, 20 touchdowns out here. I do think they wanted more out of Jalen Wright. So honestly, the efficiency stuff doesn't bother me because I think one of the biggest lessons we should have learned from this last season is guys like Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs. Fantastic real-life running backs who had their efficiency go down because of subpar to just disastrous offensive environment, which is exactly what Achane was dealing with for a good 6 weeks of the season when Tua Tagovailoa went down. We saw with Tyreek Hill. That truly just was one of, if not the single lowest scoring offenses in the NFL from about weeks 2 to week 7. And as you said, Dwain was playing through that high ankle sprain. I'm old enough to remember week 2 when we were all just terrified of playing Achane. I think it was Thursday night. We got that thumbs up from the guy over there on national, Amazon Prime TV, giving us, that thumbs up, catching a lot of passes and making up for it in volume. If you do look at his efficiency, post week 8 or so, got a little healthier, got Tua back under center. It was a bit more in line with what we've been expecting. For me, it's just like with Derrick Henry, I know that assuming we can have him stay healthy, which there's no reason to believe an injury is going to magically happen, I am knocking on wood, behind that offensive line with Lamar Jackson, 300 plus touches, pretty much guaranteed, and that offense can just go so far. But hey, Achane did lead the entire NFL in PPR points as a pure receiver. We'll see what happens in terms of, the Tyreek Hill situation. Dwain seemed like he was a bit frustrated after week 18, but, the big thing for Achane, and we saw it down the stretch of last year a bit when, we have Waddle a little bit banged up, he can win on the outside. And that is the part where if you want to move him up as high as RB3, RB4, I couldn't overly disagree, because sometimes we see the running backs, having these 50, 60 catch seasons. And it's like, okay, well, they got a lot of checkdowns. They were in an offense that didn't have any more avenues to go with the football. Achane does look like that, sort of prime Austin Eckler, that CMC Kamara caliber receiver where, yeah, maybe we should actually just start expecting him to catch 60, 70 passes a year, because he can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where you've really got to look at the underlying data. I mean, the guy had 1.45 yards per route run. That's absolutely elite. To give you the other example, Alvin Kamara this year at 1.75. People, put some respect on Alvin Kamara's name, man. Like, we're just acting like this guy's washed. 1.67 yards per route run for Jahmyr Gibbs. You look at the underlying targets per route run, 21% for Achane, 20% for Jahmyr Gibbs. So he's right there in that category. And look, I'm with you on Achane. I think he's a guy that the Dolphins, they can do a lot of different things with him. And it does come down to what do they do with the rest of their offense. But I thought it was pretty interesting that part of, the issue with Tyreek Hill is like Achane really took a big step forward. So, I mean, he partially took away Tyreek Hill's role. You got to be pretty good to do that. While the year of 2024 might have been the year of revenge for the running back position, it was also a fruitful one for wide receivers because we got an amazing rookie class. This influx of talent now leaves drafters trying to figure out, where do you take some of these year two players? How high is too high? And that's the question Ian had to ask himself. So let's dive into the ranks.
It's time for another edition of Way Too Early Fantasy Football Ranks from the fine folks at Fantasy Life, a.k.a. your boy Ian Hartitz and Dwain, the Rock McFarland. Dwain, we're kicking things off with Tier 1 league-winning ballers. I squeezed in 6 separate, ballers into this tier. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, C.D. Lamb, Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, and yes, our one true sun god, Amon-Ra St. Brown. So on the one hand, I could see the argument to just have the LSU boys, Chase and Jefferson, and their own tier at the top. I do think they deserve to, just be the consensus top 2 wide receivers. But truly, man, especially these top 5, with all due respect to St. Brown, I think any of these guys could finish as the overall wide receiver 1 in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, and Lamb just ran a little bit bad, this past season, dealt with his own injuries. You lose Dak Prescott. That's obviously going to impact you. He was the wide receiver 1 in fantasy the year before. Young player still, in his absolute prime. So no debates on Lamb being in there. And I think that's where you could potentially make a cut of like top 3 and then go to the next 3. But I'm fine with having these guys in there. Puka Nacua has done it 2 straight years. Obviously, we had the downfall of Cooper Kupp this year, but he already showed that he could be a high-end target earner the season before when Kupp was still kind of doing its thing. So even if this is a team that moves on from Cooper Kupp, maybe adds another player that might be more target competition for Puka Nacua, we know he gets so much of the design stuff, Ian, around the line of scrimmage. He's kind of like in the Deebo Samuel role, plus like being a full-time receiver that gets to do all the other stuff, where Deebo just kind of gets to do that one part of his game. Puka gets to do that plus. So we know that McVay is one of these guys that's an absolute cheat code for wide receivers. It's not easy to do, by the way. That is not easy to do. For the most part, like, wide receivers just have to be straight out ballers to go out and score fantasy points. But there are a couple of guys in this league at offensive coordinator that can make things a lot better for you. Sean McVay being one of those. I thought the interesting one, and this was a move for you since the mock draft we had, tell me your thoughts on Nico Collins, because I know he's a guy that we didn't really debate, but it's kind of a question. Hey, man, should he be going higher? I mean, once we had Stephon Diggs out of the lineup this year, 27% target share for Nico, absolute baller.
Yeah, I had A.J. Brown early on at the end of my first round here, but we are already adjusting the ranks here in January, Dwain. So yes, Nico Collins up there as the overall wide receiver 5. And again, just looking a bit closer at the rosters around the league, particularly a Texans one that might not have Tank Dell for 2025, obviously needs to recover from another horrific injury. Please, injury gods, take some freaking mercy on this dude. And also Stephon Diggs being a free agent. So even with those guys, Dwain, I still think we saw Nico emerge as really the wide receiver one, CJ Stroud, BFF in that Texans offense. But man, without, like, we're talking about potentially 180 plus targets and, similar sentiment for all these guys. But we've seen the talent for Nico, and end of the day, man, one of only 5 wide receivers averaging at least 85 yards per game over these past 2 seasons. God forbid CJ Stroud gets back to looking a little bit more like the guy we saw in 2023. I think Nico can get up there.
Yeah, and we're moving on from Bobby Slowick. We know there were some struggles there. How quickly the world can change. A guy that potentially could have had a head coaching job the year before, now in a situation where just trying to find his next role as potential OC or just an assistant coach. So tough luck there for Bobby Slowick after running hot in year one. So yeah, real interested to see what this team does. But obviously, I get why the Texans made the move. You're wanting to see more of what you saw to CJ Stroud in year one than what you saw in year two. So a lot of this does come back to Mr. Stroudian, and I think that's the biggest question here. But the thing with CJ Stroud is I don't think any of us think that it's a situation where he's going to hold Nico back, right? I mean, nobody thinks like CJ Stroud's like a terrible quarterback. It's just a question of like, hey, is he going to be more of an average middle of the road kind of quarterback, or is he going to be that elite, quarterback that we saw in season one?
Last question I wanted to really get to with this, again, tier one of fantasy wide receivers is, again, another kind of thought about what if the quarterback performance could be changing, because with Puka Nacua, I mean, it's been incredible what he's done. He is literally the wide receiver one in terms of yards per route run and targets per route run among all wide receivers with 100 targets since 2015. Like, it really is so special what he's been able to do. You mentioned, Dwain, the possibility that Cooper Kupp could end up being a bit of a cap casualty. We'll see if he's played his last down in Los Angeles or not. I agree with you. Sean McVay scheming things up is going to be great, but let's face it, from Calvin Johnson to Golden Tate to Cooper Kupp and now to Puka Nacua, Matthew Stafford, one of the biggest, fantasy wide receiver whisperers out there. And there have been some murmurs if he could be, looking to embrace retirement. So they played so well this year, I'd be kind of surprised if he's not back. But let's say, Dwain, that Stafford is also done as a Ram. Do you think Puka's just ability to thrive after the catch and get these scheme targets would be, just unique enough that he could still thrive with a lesser quarterback under center?
Yeah, I think the targets are still going to come, but the quality of target matters, right? Yards per route run, something that we like to look at for future fantasy production. It is impacted by quarterback play. So like targets are the easiest thing to look at and talk about wide receiver skill. And the reason why is because like even a bad quarterback knows to get it to their good players. It's just a matter of, can they do it accurately? Can they do it in time to allow like the fullness of the play to unfold for a guy like Puka Nacua? So yeah, we would have to see if Matthew Stafford did decide to take that path, who is going to replace him. And it could be a situation where we move Puka down to the bottom of this tier, potentially to the top of the next tier, just depending on what type of step down from Stafford we think we're dealing with. Now, we've seen guys. We saw Malik Nabers, when we talk about him in a minute, overcome terrible quarterback play. Saw Brian Thomas Jr. do it at the end of this year. But it's not an equal thing where this always works out. Like if you end up with a quarterback that can barely throw for 200 yards per game, it's going to impact your performance. And we did see that even with Malik Nabers, man. I get it. Started fast, finished really strong, but there was a middle portion of the season there. Now, he was also dealing with injuries, but you saw the impacts of the bad quarterback play. And he was a guy that went from being a high-end wide receiver one early in the year to a guy that was more like a borderline wide receiver two. And that came back mostly to the quarterback play. So we'll have to see. Like, it's just a matter of how big of a downgrade would we be talking about from Stafford? Hopefully, Stafford decides he's going to return, though.
Last guy in the tier is, again, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Don't think we have anything, too big to say about the Detroit Lions offense. Obviously, do need to adjust to life after Ben Johnson. But just wanted to give the Sun God, a shout out for leading all wide receivers in terms of EPA per target last year. And Dwain, a cool, newer stat from NFL Next Gen. Catch rate over expected. Again, Sun God was number one. Can you name, Dwain, the worst wide receiver in catch rate over expected last year?
It's got to be someone that had a deep average depth of target would be my guess. Is it somebody like that?
It's a trendy fantasy name, not maybe a little Butterfingers induced.
A little Butterfingers induced? I don't know. Who is it?
Dontavian Wicks. So I do think that kind of helps show that he's indeed
I should have known you were trying to trigger me.
Always, Dwain. Always look out for me. But yeah, guys, again, that was wide receiver one tier. Dwain mentioned Malik Nabers, though. He is not too far behind. We're getting to him and maybe some other former LSU Tigers here right after a quick word from our friends over at DraftKings. Super Bowl 59 is right around the corner, and it is the perfect time to get in on the action with my partners at DraftKings Sportsbook. Right now, they're giving all new customers $200 in bonus bets instantly after betting just $5. This is your shot to make every last play a moment to be remembered. Don't wait, run, don't walk. Download the DraftKings app now and sign up using promo code FANTASYLIFE. The crown is yours. All right, Dwain, tier 2 of the wide receivers. I titled it, Please, God, give us a good QB. 3 members right here. Got kind of teased the first 2 already, but yes, Brian Thomas Jr. coming off in this incredible rookie year. Malik Nabers, similar sentiment, and Drake London as well. Not trying to throw shade at Michael Penix, but come on, we've only seen 3 stars. Not exactly a lock to be wearing a gold jacket by the end of his career. But we'll start things off with Brian Thomas Jr., Dwain, someone who we've seen some clips with Liam Cohen, being a very interesting man in some of his early press conferences, to put it lightly. But just again, reflecting on BTJ's incredible rookie season. In terms of yards per route run since 2015, top 5 seasons. A.J. Brown, Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, Jamar Chase, and yes, Brian Thomas Jr. So pretty great company to be in. That said, we did see some pretty stark splits in terms of targets with BTJ before the bye and after the bye. That also coincided with Trevor Lawrence leaving the lineup for Mac Jones. Also coincided with Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram pretty much being out of the picture. So we do have a new scheme coming in. I would like to think it's an upgrade, but quite a few questions, Dwain, for someone who we do have ranked awfully high. That said, when you watch the guy play, just seems like the sort of talent we should kind of trust and, forget about these other small details.
Yeah, you just can't overthink it. Honestly, with Brian Thomas Jr. or Malik Nabers, you can really put them in either order that you want. I agree with you. Like when you get to a tier like this, like the tiebreaker goes to the guy that we at least think has an average quarterback. Right, and that's Trevor Lawrence. We don't know what we're going to have with the Giants. It could be an absolute train wreck. We did see Malik Nabers get on the same page with Drew Lock late in the year. They seem to have a little bit of magic. So Nabers has shown he can overcome, the bad quarterback play. But I would still want to lean to the guy that finished really strong. And we've got the new offensive coordinator or the new head coach that was a great offensive coordinator for the Bucs coming in. We got the quarterback and Trevor Lawrence that's at least has shown he can support fantasy contributors to your lineup. So I do think it's right to have Brian Thomas Jr. at the top of this tier. The only thing I would change in this tier is I think Drake London actually belongs in the tier below. I think we're dealing with a bit too much of a small sample, in my opinion, for Michael Penix Jr. As many good things as we saw from Penix, I think we can also go back and look at a lot of negative things. Yes, strong arm, wants to put the throws in the window, but I don't know that we can be so sure about him. I mean, he there's a lot of questions, with Penix. And then on top of that, Drake London does not have the big playability of Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas Jr. So these guys have all shown they can earn targets. I think Brian Thomas Jr. and Malik Nabers, they are on a different plane, though, when you talk about the things they can do with the ball in their hands. You think about Drake London, I don't think about a guy that, man, just get it to him anywhere and he's going to be gone to the house. I think, get it to him anywhere. He's a good player. He's probably going to come down with it. He's going to give you size. He's going to box out the defender. But I don't think of him in the same vein as those other two. So I would probably go really with and I know it gets tough because you don't want to make these tiers too small. Making tiers, honestly, because you're thinking of the name for the tier, right? You're thinking how you're splitting these players up, and it determines a lot, like the way it ends up coming out. And sometimes you're like, no, I actually just want this receiver higher, but I can't give him his own tier. So I know the pain that you're going through because I go through this every year as well. So I think these tiers are really good. My one thing would be probably moving Drake London to the tier below, though.
There is a difference in kind of expected workload as well, because BTJ and Nabers, these are the engines of their entire offense, not even just the passing game. Over in Atlanta, I don't think anyone's expecting Darnell Mooney, Kyle Pitts, or Ray McLeod to unseat London as that number one pass game option. But as we know, Bijan Robinson going to be racking up more touches than just about any running back out there. So it is a fair point. And with Michael Penix, you see the flashes. That sideline shot he hit to Kadero Hodge and some of the throws to Drake London, particularly in that week 18. I don't want to call it a classic against the Panthers, but a pretty freaking fun game there at the end of the year. Had some high highs and everything, and that's fantastic. But overall, guys, just minus 4.4% completion rate over expected for Penix. That was the 6th lowest mark among 47 qualified quarterbacks. So again, just not exactly a sure thing just yet, just like the situations under center in Jacksonville and New York as well. But we'll say London, PPR wide receiver 9. with Kirk Cousins and was up to wide receiver 3 with Penix. Small sample, be damned. I get it. Still someone that I would like to be betting on, even if, again, maybe should have kept the tier to the LSU Tigers, as Dwain said. But let's go ahead and move on to that next tier anyway. We are now talking about ballers with some competition. So, again, great wide receivers here. However, we are expecting them to have to share maybe a bit more of the workload in 2025 compared to 2024. So, wide receivers 10 through 14, I have A.J. Brown, Terry McLaurin, Lab McConkey, Jackson Smith, Najigba, and Tyreek Hill. So in terms of AJB, look, Devonta Smith and Dallas Goedert, we know what's going on here. Everyone that's watched the playoffs understands what's happening. Still a very great wide receiver, but in an offense with Saquon Barkley, only going to be so many targets to go around. So just keep on reading, man, and hopefully the good times will be going for Brown. Otherwise, though, I think the two big changes we could see, Terry McLaurin in Washington and Lab McConkey in LA. I'd be shocked if these teams don't add some level of high target competition. And on the one hand, McConkey and McLaurin, very good players, are not going to disappear from the offense or anything. But man, talking about T. Higgins, who we'll get to in a little bit, someone who could wind up on maybe either of these teams. If you do add a legit 1A or 1B option in these offenses, how far could you see yourself dropping Lad and Terry down the ranks?
I'm not going to get too worried about it. Like T. Higgins is like worst case scenario. But I think both players played well enough this year, especially Lad McConkey. Like I love Terry, but we have seen Terry in the past when he's had more target competition. Mostly it's been due to bad quarterback play, let's be honest. But we have seen him, look more like a wide receiver 3, a wide receiver 2 in fantasy versus what we got this year, which is really a wide receiver 1. But Lad McConkey, you're kind of going back to the stuff with Puka from last year. I feel like people are just going to try to find ways to talk themselves out of it. Like he was borderline right there with Brian Thomas Jr. as well as Malik Nabers. Yes, he was a little bit below those guys, but in most years we would be talking about Lad McConkey being the best wide receiver of the rookie class. It just so happens he lives in a loaded class where we had so many good young wide receivers. So I just really wouldn't worry about it too much with McConkey. And I think there's a lot of room here. Like there's no one else on the team that's really a good target earner. So you could add T. Higgins to the mix here, for example, and you could see 50% of the targets going to just Lab McConkey and T. Higgins. And I think we also have the confidence in Justin Herbert to know that he can support 2 really good players like that. So wouldn't worry too much about Lad. A little bit more with Terry, but again, still not that much because you got Jaden Daniels, man. Jaden Daniels looked great. I think there's still plenty of meat left on the bone as far as what he can do as a passer. Looks unfazed by anything. Ian, if they just decided they wanted to run the ball more, I'm not so sure that Jaden Daniels couldn't throw for, 4,500, 5,000 yards. Like, I think that's easily in his range of outcomes, given how he looked as a rookie quarterback. Again, 1 year, small sample, so not quite as confident, as a passer as what we saw from Justin Herbert. But look, based off what we know and what he did at the end of his career in college at LSU, man, like the sky's the limit for him. So I like the quarterbacks. So that lessens my concern.